One or two like Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan want to stay in, and you know why? Because they have spent millions of pounds lobbying over years to get regulations that suit them and harm their competitors. And I'm afraid to say that the interests of these giant banks are not the same as the interests of the City of London, let alone of the British economy in general. We want a much more diverse, pluralist market where you can have startups, where you can have competition.
Businesses of all kinds want to remain in, Dan, not just banks.
I'm just going to interrupt there. We are still here in the studio, but it was interesting to hear you talk about that. But you were concentrating a lot there on what happens in the city and jobs and trade. But one of the big issues in the in or out debate is the issue of immigration. And Lucy, I just want to talk to you. One of the EU defining projects that people will say hasn't really done Britain many favours is the freedom of movement. With the EU growing from 6 to 28 members now, many people from the EU have opted to come to Britain and work, and a lot of people that will be voting in this referendum are saying that we can't cope. They're saying that if we're out of Europe, that problem will be solved. What's your view on the immigration issue?
Well, free movement works both ways, and there are roughly 2 million Britons in the rest of the EU, as there are around 2 million EU migrants here. So it's a two-way street. And I think what people do think is fair, if people come here, contribute, work hard, and are part of the system and are helping our economy, and actually what the Prime Minister is negotiating is to clamp down on migrant benefits, to make sure that people who come here are working and not sort of pulling on the welfare system, which I think people would see as fair. But actually challenging Dan and those who say leaving the EU would mean we could control free movement, actually if we still want access to that single market, we still have to accept free movement, which Dan himself has conceded in the past. So I think we've got to be clear, what does leaving the EU actually achieve, and the likelihood, in order to keep the benefits we have, trading with the largest market in the world without tariffs and barriers, would mean accepting free movement.
So Dan, perhaps you can answer that. What would leaving the EU mean in that respect?
Well, there's a difference between free movement of labour, the ability to come and work somewhere else, and free rights of residence and bringing your family and claiming welfare and so on, which is a much more recent thing that the EU has invented. I think this is about control. You know, I don't think most people in Britain are content to have a measure of controlled primary legal immigration. Of course, there are some who say there should be zero, but that is, I think, a minority view, if my constituency is anything to go by. What people want is to feel that we are ultimately in charge of who comes in and in what numbers. And as long as we're in the EU, they have no such sense. And I think it is a particular injustice to Brits of Commonwealth origin. There'll be people watching this programme now who know how difficult it is, you know, just to bring Granny over for a wedding, because of the extraordinary crackdown on our visa regime for non-EU nationals that we've had to implement in order to free up unlimited space for people who have zero connection to this country. And I think that is no way to treat the families of men who volunteered for us in 2 world wars. I want us to have a global, fair migration policy where we take the best talent and we don't allow people to elbow their way to the front of the queue simply because they happen to hold an EU passport.
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.